The hallway outside the mediation room smelled like overused carpet cleaner and institutional coffee. Camila sat alone on the metal bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a manila folder resting beside her like a quiet weapon. She was dressed with care, navy blouse, tailored slacks, small silver earrings. She didn't want to look combative. She wanted to look like the woman she was, composed, thoughtful, and done being afraid. Across from her, two men in pressed suits leaned against the opposite wall, whispering to each other between glances at their phones. One of them chuckled. She didn't have to guess what they were talking about. Her former supervisor, Richard Bellman, hadn't changed in the 6 years since she'd left the agency. That subtle sneer, the dismissive tone, the way he always found a way to twist a narrative before anyone else could speak, it was all still there. Camila shifted her gaze to the plaque on the door, Mediation Hearing Room B. Clean brass letters, cool and professional. She had imagined this day for years, but not quite like this. Not the artificial air conditioning biting at her skin, not the cheap chairs, not the low drone of fluorescent lights. She thought it would feel more dramatic. More like justice. Instead, it just felt dull. Bureaucratic. Like so many things Richard had always buried beneath protocol and polite cruelty, when the assistant came to call them in, Richard stood up first. He adjusted his tie, nodded to his attorneys, and walked in with the confidence of someone who believed the rules were made to bend in his direction. Camila followed, heart pounding but feet steady. The room was simple, long table, whiteboard, a pitcher of lukewarm water at the center. A mediator sat at the head, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a calm tone. Camila liked her instantly. Please be seated, the mediator said. Let's begin with some opening remarks. As everyone settled, Richard leaned just slightly in Camila's direction. Not enough for the mediator to hear, but just enough for his team, and for her. She's unstable, he muttered with a smirk, then leaned back in his chair. His attorney suppressed a grin. The other one scribbled something down. It was the same tactic he'd used for years at the agency, subtle digs, quiet assassinations of character, never loud enough to be called out, always just under the surface. Camila had once watched a bright young intern resign after 6 months under Richard's supervision, whispering, I think I'm going crazy. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this. She remembered comforting the girl in the break room, offering tea and quiet reassurance. Camila didn't flinch this time. She didn't even blink. She simply opened her folder and set it in front of her, one hand resting lightly on the document inside. The familiar header was visible, just enough, Superior Court of California, Family Division. The room fell into procedural rhythm. The mediator laid out the ground rules. Richard's lawyer opened with a carefully rehearsed statement, painting Camila as emotionally reactive, unreliable, disgruntled. A woman whose grievances stemmed from professional disappointment rather than real misconduct. Camila listened quietly, her hands still. When it was her turn to speak, the mediator asked gently, Ms. Serrano, would you like to respond to these claims? Camila inhaled, slow and controlled. She looked first at the mediator, then at Richard, and finally at the folder. I'd like to clarify a few things, she said, her voice calm. But first, I think this document might be relevant to today's discussion. She opened the folder and slid the report forward. Silence rippled through the room like a dropped glass. It's a psychiatric evaluation, she continued. Filed during Mr. Bellman's custody proceedings in 2018. By his former wife. One of Richard's attorneys reached forward quickly. Eyes narrowing as they scanned the top of the document. I obtained it legally, Camila added, preempting their objection. It was entered into public record in Los Angeles County. I've highlighted the relevant sections. Particularly the diagnoses of narcissistic traits, emotional manipulation, and coercive behavior within intimate relationships. The mediator took the document, beginning to read. Richard stiffened, his face blanching. His eyes flicked toward his lawyers, who were suddenly flipping through their own papers, whispering fast. Ms. Serrano, the mediator said, not looking up, this is substantial. How long have you had this? 2 years, Camila said. I never planned to use it. I only brought it because I anticipated Mr. Bellman might attempt to discredit me, again. She turned slowly to look at Richard. I'm not unstable, she said. I'm prepared. The room hung in a silence so tight it felt like the air had been vacuumed out. For once, Richard said nothing. He stared at the table, jaw clenched. Camila sat back in her chair, the manila folder now empty in front of her. For the first time in years, she felt her shoulders relax. This wasn't just a defense. It was an unveiling. And it had only just begun. The mediation was paused. Not ended, just paused, under the guise of procedural fairness. The mediator, trying to remain neutral, had requested a brief recess so both parties could review the new information. But everyone in that room knew what had just happened. A shift. A rupture. A man used to controlling the narrative had lost control in under 3 minutes. Camila stepped outside the hearing room and into the corridor, the cold light still humming above her, but everything felt different now. Her hands were no longer trembling. Her chest, which had felt like a pressure chamber before she spoke, was lighter. Not because the battle was over, it wasn't, but because she had finally stopped playing by his rules. She didn't pace. She didn't rehearse the next steps. She just sat, back on the same metal bench, breathing in and out, the document still open in her lap. The report had been difficult to read the first time. Not because it was surprising, on the contrary, it had been painfully familiar, but because it gave words to what she'd always felt in the shadows. Emotional gaslighting. Chronic dismissal. Strategic cruelty. All wrapped in politeness. And plausible deniability. She had met Richard Bellman 15 years earlier, when she transferred to the county's Child Protective Services office after her mother passed. Back then, he had a reputation for being tough but brilliant. A master of policy. Charismatic with the board. Dependable under pressure. His eyes could scan a case file and diagnose procedural flaws like a surgeon. But those who worked closely with him knew something else, something no one wanted to put in writing. He isolated people. Not physically, but emotionally. One moment you were praised in a meeting, and the next your caseload would double, or your emails would mysteriously go unanswered. Camila had watched colleagues deteriorate under him. She had felt it herself, the gradual erosion of confidence, the hesitancy to speak in meetings, the internalized doubt, and now, reading his ex-wife's psychiatric report, she realized, it hadn't been just her. Inside the folder were excerpts she had highlighted the night before. Under the glow of a desk lamp and a mug of cooling chamomile tea, Mr. Bellman exhibits patterns of emotional invalidation, presenting a calm exterior, while undermining others' sense of reality. Patient reports chronic anxiety symptoms, particularly after interactions involving subtle gaslighting and coercion, behavioral patterns consistent with narcissistic defenses and control-seeking tactics in personal and professional environments. It was more than just damning. It was diagnostic. The door opened behind her, and one of Richard's attorneys stepped out, the younger one, Harris. Early 30s, sharp features, expensive haircut. He approached her with forced politeness. Ms. Serrano, we'd like to request a private sidebar before we resume. Off the record, he said. She didn't move. Why? There may be a way forward that avoids prolonged proceedings. Camila studied his expression. He wasn't offering a favor. He was damage controlling. Tell Richard I'll wait inside, she said, standing and walking back into the room before he could reply. The mediator was speaking quietly to Richard when Camila entered. He looked up at her like she had betrayed some secret pact. But she didn't look away. She took her seat, smoothed her blouse, and waited. Harris followed, clearly unsettled. He whispered something in Richard's ear, but Richard shook his head once, sharply. Then, the mediator turned toward Camila. Ms. Serrano, do you wish to proceed with your statement? She nodded. I was a social worker for over 30 years, she began. I've worked with survivors of trauma, children removed from dangerous homes, families rebuilding from cycles of abuse. I've testified in court, I've filed reports, I've been cross-examined more times than I can count. And through all of that, I've learned one thing very clearly: patterns don't lie. She looked directly at Richard. I don't need to prove that you manipulated me. I don't need to catalog every time you withheld resources, reassigned my cases, ignored my emails, or subtly implied that I was too emotional to manage field work. Because I'm not the only one who lived through it. Your ex-wife documented it. A licensed psychiatrist verified it. And now it's public record. Richard's lawyer tried to interject, but the mediator raised a hand. Let her finish. Camila continued. You didn't just try to discredit my work. You tried to fracture my sense of self. And when I left the agency, early, against my will, I thought I'd failed. But I didn't. I survived you. And now I'm here not because I'm bitter, but because I won't let you rewrite the story again. She reached into her bag and pulled out another document. This is my resignation letter from 2019, she said. I never sent it. At the time, I didn't want to burn bridges. But reading it now, I realize I was already writing the truth. She handed it to the mediator. The letter was short, handwritten, raw. I'm stepping away because I no longer feel safe in an environment where I'm persistently undermined, invalidated, and strategically silenced. I no longer trust the leadership to protect staff from psychological coercion disguised as management style. I refuse to let my dignity be corroded by subtle cruelty. The mediator read it slowly. No one else spoke. Camila leaned back again, not triumphant, but grounded. She didn't need a breakdown. She didn't need to scream. She had facts, records, history, and that was enough. After the session adjourned for the day, Camila stepped out into the late afternoon sun, blinking against the sudden brightness. The sky above Los Angeles was unusually clear, no haze, no marine layer, just a wide, pale blue dome stretched out above the low courthouse buildings. She stood on the edge of the courthouse steps for a moment, scanning the plaza below. Her reflection glanced back at her in the glass doors, a woman in her 50s, gray streaks proudly running through her dark hair, steady eyes, shoulders set. Still here, she hadn't expected to feel so calm. What surprised her most wasn't the reaction from Richard's team, the awkward glances, the legal scrambling, the passive-aggressive civility. It was the quiet in her own chest. The absence of the usual self-doubt that always seemed to sneak in after moments like this. This time, it hadn't come. Maybe it wouldn't. Her phone buzzed. Voicemail, one new message. From Layla Serrano. She tapped play. Mom? Just checking in. I know today's the hearing. You probably don't want to talk yet, but I just wanted to say, whatever happens in there, I'm proud of you. Seriously. Call me when you're ready. Love you. Camila closed her eyes for a moment, letting her daughter's voice settle over her like warm fabric. Layla, 28 now, finishing her graduate degree in psychology. Camila had spent years shielding her from the worst parts of her job, her exit, and especially from men like Richard, but Layla had always seen more than Camila realized. Maybe more than Camila herself wanted to admit. She turned the corner and headed toward the garage. But halfway down the sidewalk, she slowed. Across the street stood a 7-story building she hadn't thought about in a long time, the old CPS regional office, the one where everything happened. IT had been vacated 2 years ago after the agency downsized and restructured. But the shell remained, same faded bricks, same cracked signage, same buzz of traffic from Olympic Boulevard nearby. Camila crossed without thinking, her heels clicking against the pavement, drawn not by nostalgia but by something deeper. The need to look the past in the eye. The glass doors were locked, but she peered in. The lobby was empty. Stripped walls. A single plant, long dead, stood in the corner behind the reception desk. A ghost of a place where people once fought over placement decisions, cried after home visits, passed out birthday cupcakes in the break room. Where she once believed she could stay until retirement, until Richard made sure she couldn't. She remembered the moment it shifted. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a shouting match. It was something smaller. A Tuesday morning, 9:15 a.m. She'd walked into her office to find her caseload had been reassigned without warning. No explanation. Just a short email from Richard. We've determined a redistribution will improve efficiency. Efficiency. A word he used like a scalpel. From that point on, it was a slow, calculated erosion. Meetings scheduled without her. Her name left off memos. Field reports questioned without cause. Once, a junior staffer mentioned to her in passing, Richard says you've been really off lately. Everything okay at home? Camila hadn't replied. She'd just smiled. Standing outside now, staring through the dark glass of that same lobby, she could almost hear the conversations echoing. The fluorescent lights buzzing. The quiet sobs behind closed doors after particularly brutal home removals. The good people who stayed too long. The brave ones who left too soon. The walls remembered. She took a photo. Just one. Not for court. Not for evidence. For herself. Proof that she had stood here. That she had survived. On her way back to the car, she stopped by a small coffee cart near the corner. A young barista with purple hair and chipped eyeliner took her order. Black coffee, no sugar. You look like you just kicked someone's ass, the girl said with a grin as she handed over the cup. Camila smiled, a genuine one this time. Just reclaimed something that was mine. As she sipped, her mind wandered to the hearing's next session. There were still things to address, timelines, context, corroborating testimony. But the psychiatric report had done more than shake Richard's credibility. It had opened a crack in the image he'd so carefully constructed, and she intended to widen it, brick by brick. She had a list. Back at her apartment, she laid it out on the dining table. Names, dates, internal memos, performance reviews, anonymized employee exit surveys she had copied years ago. Not confidential, but quietly telling. She'd never weaponized them. But now? Now she was going to build a pattern. One the mediator, and eventually the state review board, couldn't ignore. Richard had always operated just below the threshold of formal complaint. That was his genius. Subtle enough to avoid documentation, careful enough to keep everything in the gray zone. But when enough gray adds up, it turns black. Camila picked up a printed email dated August 2017. A colleague named Janelle had written it after resigning suddenly. Just one line stood out. Working under Richard made me feel like I was constantly unraveling, and yet I could never point to a single thread. Camila added it to the file. The next chapter of this process wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about ruining Richard. It was about restoring something to all the people who had been quietly damaged under his authority, including herself. She looked down at her folder, thicker now, more detailed. She didn't feel righteous. Just resolute. Tomorrow, she'd walk back into that room. Not with rage. With precision. The unraveling had begun. The morning of the second session broke humid and gray, the kind of Los Angeles day where the sky threatened rain but rarely followed through. Camila stood by her apartment window, coffee in hand, watching a crow hop along the edge of the fire. Escape. The bird paused, tilted its head toward her like it knew something she didn't, then took off into the still air. She turned back to the dining table. The folder she'd built overnight was ready. It wasn't just papers now, it was a timeline. Annotated. Cross-referenced. Each item layered with quiet significance: employee departure emails, performance reviews that suddenly dipped for no apparent reason, internal communications that subtly shifted after someone had a conflict with Richard. A map of manipulation, built not from drama but from patterns. The law didn't always care about impressions. But mediation? Mediation lived in the gray space. And she knew how to navigate gray. By the time she arrived at the courthouse, she was 15 minutes early. The waiting room was nearly empty, save for a man reading a newspaper and a janitor mopping in slow loops. Camila sat near the door, her folder on her lap again, this time heavier, not just in content, but in what it meant. She didn't look up when Richard arrived. He walked in with the same lawyer from the day before. Harris, but without the older partner. Camila noticed. The shift. The silent tell. The smell of tension. Richard didn't look at her, didn't speak, just adjusted his cuffs and sat across the room, posture rigid. The mediator arrived exactly on time, greeted them with a brief nod, and led them in without ceremony. "Let's proceed," she said, once the door was closed. "Ms. Serrano, you mentioned additional documentation?" Camila opened the folder slowly. "Yes. I'd like to submit materials that speak to a long-standing behavioral pattern within the agency. I've highlighted names and dates, but removed any confidential client data. Everything here is internal and non-classified." She passed the file to the mediator, then glanced at Richard. His jaw was tight. Harris leaned in, flipping through the pages quickly, brow furrowing with each turn. "These include resignation letters, employee surveys, and email communications between Mr. Bellman and multiple staff members from 2015 through 2019, Camila continued. "Taken separately, they may seem minor. Taken together, they illustrate a clear and consistent pattern of psychological undermining, targeted demotions, and the use of bureaucratic tools as a form of retaliation." Richard finally spoke. "This is anecdotal. You're trying to paint me as some kind of villain based on employee gossip." Camila looked directly at him. "You once told me, in front of a probationary intern, that the best way to keep order is to destabilize before you delegate. Do you deny that?" He blinked. "That's not how I remember it." "That intern," Camila replied, "filed for early transfer after just 3 months. Her supervisor's note said she cited persistent workplace anxiety and unpredictable leadership." The mediator flipped through the file, stopping at one page. "Exit interview summary," she read aloud. "Staff member reports feeling isolated, chronically second-guessed, and reluctant to voice disagreement for fear of being reassigned or frozen out." Camila added, "There are 6 more like that." Harris cleared his throat. "Ms. Serrano, how did you gain access to these materials?" "They were stored in the shared agency archive," she replied. "All personnel with level 3 access could read them. I printed them before my departure. Nothing was confidential. I simply noticed what others didn't want to connect. Or what others didn't find significant," Richard said, bitterly. Camila shrugged. "That's the story of your career, isn't it? 100 little cuts no one wanted to bother naming." The room held still for a moment. Then the mediator turned to Richard. "Mr. Bellman, do you wish to respond?" He leaned forward. "I led that office for 17 years. I improved response time metrics, closed 4 budget deficits, and passed 2 internal audits with commendations. If a few employees didn't like my style, that's unfortunate, but it's hardly misconduct." Camila shook her head. "You didn't lead. You controlled. People didn't leave because the work was hard. They left because you made it harder than it needed to be. You turned stress into a weapon." She took out the last document. One she'd debated, including, "This is a personal letter I received after I resigned," she said, sliding it across. "It was sent anonymously, but I recognized the handwriting. Janelle H., one of the staff therapists. She was gone 3 months before me." The mediator picked it up, scanned the lines, and read aloud. "You were the only one who ever called it what it was. Everyone else just learned how to survive him. I wish I'd had the guts to say something out loud." "I hope you do." Silence. The kind that feels like truth is settling into the floorboards. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Harris whispered something in his ear. This time, Richard didn't interrupt. The mediator folded her hands. Given the gravity of these materials, and the corroborative nature of the documentation, I'll need to consult the ethics board before proceeding further. Camila nodded. She wasn't expecting a final verdict today. Outside, the sky had darkened. Rain finally began to fall, light at first, then steadier. Camila stood under the awning outside the building, watching people rush past with newspapers over their heads, wet sandals slapping pavement. Richard exited a few minutes later, walking quickly toward his car. He didn't look back. Camila didn't need him to. She opened her umbrella, took a slow breath, and stepped into the street. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was chasing justice. She felt like it was finally catching up. The ethics board didn't call that week. Camila knew it wouldn't be immediate. Government wheels turned slowly, especially when the matter involved a respected administrator and allegations that existed in the space between formal complaint and personal trauma. Still, the silence scratched at her point. 3 days passed. Then 5.by the following Tuesday, she had stopped checking her phone obsessively. She went for long walks, cleaned out her closet, caught up on Layla's thesis drafts. But every night, as she made tea and settled into her favorite chair by the window, her thoughts wandered back to the same question: how many others? It wasn't about revenge anymore. That flame had burned out long ago. Now, it was about inventory. How many people had quietly absorbed the damage and moved on, telling themselves they were imagining it? How many had minimized what they went through because it hadn't left a bruise you could see? She began reaching out. At first, just one email, to a former colleague named Tyrese, now working in a neighboring county's foster system. He'd been one of the most empathetic caseworkers she'd ever met, and one of the earliest casualties of Richard's leadership style. Camila wrote simply, "Hey Ty, I know it's been a while. Something's happening with Bellman, long overdue. If you ever want to talk about your experience, or even just catch up, I'm here. Camila." He replied within the hour. Camila. Jesus. Just seeing his name made my chest tighten. Of course I want to talk. When and where? They met that Thursday at a diner in Echo Park, halfway between their neighborhoods. Tyrese was older now, grayer, leaner, but the warmth in his eyes hadn't changed. Neither had the weight he carried behind them. He didn't waste time. He did the same thing to me, Tyrese said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Started with subtle things. Reassignments. Passive-aggressive evaluations. Then the incident. With the Ramirez file, remember that? Camila nodded slowly. She hadn't thought about that case in years. A messy removal order, conflicting reports, a missing signature that nearly led to a legal complaint. I took the fall for that. Tyrese continued. But I double-checked everything before submitting it. You know who was supposed to co-sign that file before it went out? Camila didn't even have to say it, Bellman. Tyrese leaned back. I brought it up. Politely. In private. Next week, I got assigned to the South LA overflow list, 47 active cases. No warning. Camila felt her stomach tighten. She'd seen him burning out back then, but he had said so little. Always so professional, so calm. You were one of the best social workers we had, she said quietly. And you left like your hands were tied behind your back. They were, Tyrese replied. But no one believed me. He was too careful. Too composed. And I didn't want to sound like I was blaming the system. Camila nodded. She knew that silence well. Tyrese reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled notebook. I kept notes. From back then. Just to stay sane, you know? He handed it to her, page after page. Dates. Interactions. Memos. Notes like, Bellman made another casual remark about my tone in meetings, said it came off too passionate. Asked me if everything was okay at home after I questioned a procedural change. Weaponized concern. Got passed over for promotion after 3 years of spotless reviews. Bellman said I wasn't quite leadership material. Camila turned the pages slowly. It wasn't a diary. It was documentation. And it mirrored everything she'd lived through. She looked up. Would you be willing to submit this to the board? Tyrese hesitated, then nodded. If it helps others, yeah. I'll stand behind it. That night, back home, Camila scanned the pages and added them to her now bulging file. It felt like a living organism, the truth, multiplying. Not because she was digging, but because people were finally willing to speak. The next day, 2 more emails arrived. Point 1 from Samantha Chu, a junior intake coordinator who had resigned suddenly in 2016. The subject line read, I always thought it was just me. Another from Janelle, yes, the therapist who had sent the anonymous letter. She had seen Camila's name mentioned in an internal review memo about the hearing and wanted to come forward. She wrote, I still have nightmares about the last months at the office. He didn't scream or slam doors, he just made me question everything I knew about myself. If you're putting something together, I want in. No more silence. Camila replied to them both, arranging calls for the weekend. What had started as a single document, a psychiatric report, had become something else entirely, a reckoning. By Sunday night, she had statements from 5 former employees. Some were willing to testify, others asked to remain anonymous for now, but all of them shared stories that aligned. Quiet abuse, chipped away confidence, muted exits, and through it all, Richard Bellman remained untouched, until now. The ethics board finally called Monday morning. Ms. Serrano, we've received your supplementary materials. We're moving into formal inquiry. You may be called for further testimony. Is that acceptable? Camila answered without hesitation. Yes. It's more than acceptable. After the call ended, she sat at her desk for a long time. No music. No phone. Just silence and the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Outside, the city pulsed in its usual way, distant sirens, muffled car horns, the constant breath of something always moving. She thought about all the people who had walked out of that building carrying invisible wounds. The ones who never said a word. The ones who did and were punished for it. The ones who saw and stayed silent, and still carry guilt in their bones. There are things you don't forget, even when no one else was looking. Camila was finally making sure they were seen. The morning the inquiry officially began, Camila didn't wear anything new. She chose the same outfit she had worn the day Richard whispered, "She's unstable," across the table: navy blouse, pressed slacks, silver earrings. Not out of sentimentality, but for continuity. She wanted them to see the same woman. The one who didn't flinch. The ethics board inquiry was held in a different building, more formal, more clinical. No warm-toned mediation rooms. This space was fluorescent lit. Sound dampened, windowless. Government functionality, stripped of charm. But Camila didn't need comfort. She needed clarity. There were 6 people on the panel, 3 women, 2 men, and 1 observer from the Department of Human Services. They sat in a curved row, tablets in front of them, pens in hand, voices low. Neutral. That made them dangerous. Not out of malice, but out of their ability to withhold judgment until the facts bled all the way through. Camila sat across from them, water bottle unopened, folder in front of her like a soldier's pack. Across the room, Richard sat with Harris. He looked different this time, not disheveled, but smaller. His suit was still expensive, his shoes polished, but something in his posture had cracked. There was a delay in his reactions, like he was still catching up to the reality around him. For the first time, he wasn't leading the room. The chairwoman of the board began, "We're here to evaluate allegations of workplace misconduct, abuse of authority, and sustained psychological manipulation within the Child Protective Services Agency, involving Mr. Richard Bellman. Today's session is preliminary. We'll hear from both parties and review corroborating documentation." Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't here to comfort anyone. She was here to listen. Camila was asked to speak first. She did not read from a script. "I'm not here because I had a bad boss," she began. "I'm here because I saw good people broken slowly and strategically under someone who knew exactly how far he could go without ever crossing a legal line." She told them about the isolation, the sudden reassignments, the strategic omission of her name from important emails, the constant implication that she was too sensitive, too emotional, too unstable. The code words used to undermine without evidence. "I spent years wondering if it was just me," she said. "Until I started seeing it in others. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to undo the damage." She passed forward Tyrese's notebook, Samantha's email, Janelle's written statement, each stapled and tagged. The board read in silence, highlighters in hand. Richard's turn came next. He cleared his throat. "I've worked in public service for over 2 decades. I've made hard decisions. Not everyone liked them. That doesn't make me abusive." His voice was even, but thinner than usual. Not defensive, calculated. He described his leadership as structured, his expectations firm but fair. He alluded to budget pressures, complex staffing challenges, the difficulty of managing trauma-exposed employees. Camila watched as he spoke, not the words, but the posture. The effort it took him to sound reasonable, composed, innocent. She had seen it before, during review meetings, when he would downplay complaints with calm language and professional tone, but this time, the panel had more than just his voice. They had context. One of the board members leaned forward. "Mr. Bellman, how do you explain the volume of personnel resignations from your team over a 5-year span, particularly from high-performing individuals?" "Social work is a burnout profession," he replied smoothly. "High turnover is, unfortunately, common." Another board member flipped to a highlighted line in Tyrese's notes. And the phrase, "You need to learn how to be quiet if you want to be promoted." Did you ever say that to Mr. Green? Richard paused. I don't recall saying that. But you won't deny it? No, I won't deny it outright. I don't have memory of that specific conversation. Camila saw it, the subtle shift in the room. The first crack in the wall of plausible deniability. It wasn't about proving every word. It was about showing the pattern. And the pattern was showing itself, piece by piece. By mid-afternoon, the tone of the inquiry had changed. What began as a routine investigation now felt like something heavier. The panel didn't rush. They asked follow-up questions. They cited excerpts from documents Camila had submitted. They even requested the full resignation archive from the CPS's HR department for comparison. Richard was unraveling, not because he was being yelled at, but because he couldn't charm or outmaneuver data. The truth wasn't coming in a wave. It was dripping into the room, slow and undeniable. At one point, the chairwoman asked him directly, "Do you believe emotional manipulation is possible without shouting or overt threats?" Richard hesitated. "I suppose it could be, in theory." Camila's voice was quiet, but firm. "It's not a theory. It's lived experience. And you've been the architect of it for years." When the session ended, the chairwoman said only this: "We are not issuing any determination today. But given the scope of testimony and documentation, we are officially escalating this matter to formal review. Mr. Bellman, you are hereby placed under internal investigation, pending administrative leave." The words landed with a strange weight. Heavier than expected, but quieter than Camila had imagined. Richard blinked slowly, his face unreadable. Harris put a hand on his arm, but Richard didn't move. Camila gathered her things calmly. She didn't look at Richard as she stood. Not out of spite, but because she no longer needed to. Outside, the hallway was empty. The air still smelled like printer toner and dry carpet, but it felt different now. As she walked toward the elevator, she caught her own reflection in the glass panel beside the door. Same navy blouse. Same earrings. But something was gone from her face, something heavy. A tension she hadn't realized she'd carried until it was lifted. She didn't smile, she didn't need to, she just looked herself in the eye, nodded once, and stepped inside. The call came 3 days later. Camila was rinsing dishes when her phone buzzed on the countertop. She almost didn't hear it over the sound of the water. She dried her hands slowly, hesitant. Part of her had started to believe she wouldn't hear anything for weeks. Maybe months. That the system would stall, that the momentum would slip through the cracks. But there it was, caller ID, Ethics Review Board. She answered. "Miss Serrano? This is Marianne Clancy, lead investigator assigned to the Bellman inquiry. I wanted to let you know that a formal suspension has been issued pending further disciplinary proceedings. In the meantime, your testimony will be referenced in the internal audit. And, we may need more from you." Camila didn't speak immediately. Marianne continued, her tone shifting. "Off the record, I'll say this, we've seen signs of structural protection in this case. People shielding Bellman, or more often, choosing not to see what they didn't want to deal with. But your documents have opened something. There's no going back." Camila thanked her, said she was available, then hung up and leaned on the edge of the sink. The window above her showed a strip of overcast sky. A plane passed in the distance, soundless from here. Somewhere out there, Richard Bellman was reading the same notice, but Camila didn't feel victorious. Not exactly, she felt, disoriented. The fight was shifting again, from external proof to internal reckoning. With systems. With silence. With the people who had chosen to look away. That night, she pulled out a manila envelope she hadn't opened in years. Inside, old staff photos from retirement parties, printouts of agency newsletters, and one piece of paper she had nearly thrown away multiple times, a letter of recommendation Richard had written for her in 2014. It read, "Camila Serrano is a capable, efficient, and emotionally intelligent team leader whose deep knowledge of child welfare systems has made her a valuable asset to the department." Camila stared at the words. The falseness of it stung. Not because it was a lie, exactly, but because it was written at a time when the undermining had already begun. He was always this way. Compliment in the open, control in the shadows. She flipped the page over. Nothing on the back, and then something shifted in her chest. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end was cautious. "Hello? Monique. It's Camila." A pause. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know. I'm calling because I think you remember what happened the day Anna quit." The line was quiet, then a long breath. "I remember everything about that day. Anna had been a supervisor, one of the best. She quit suddenly in 2017, after a closed-door meeting with Richard. No notice. No farewell. Just gone. And Monique, her assistant, had been outside the office the entire time," Camila continued, gently. I know it's been a long time. But if you're willing, the board needs to hear what you saw. Even if it's small. Monique hesitated. I'm not sure it's safe. You know how the agency works. People disappear in ways that don't look like retaliation on paper. I know, Camila said. But things are moving now. I think your voice would matter. Another pause. Then, he made her cry. Not with shouting, with silence. With the way he twisted her words, asked her if she felt stable enough to lead. She came out shaking. Said she didn't want to be the next case. Those were her words. She packed up within an hour. Camila closed her eyes. Would you be willing to put that in writing? I think I need to, Monique said quietly. I'm tired of pretending I didn't see. They agreed to meet later that week. Camila ended the call and sat back, the walls of her apartment suddenly feeling thinner. She wasn't alone in this. She never had been. But what made the system so effective, what allowed Richard to operate for so long, was the isolation. The belief that each person's experience was singular, too subjective to matter. And now, piece by piece, that illusion was breaking. Still, there was something else. A more uncomfortable realization. Richard didn't build that culture alone. He had help, passive, complicit, cowardly help. Supervisors who overlooked things. Colleagues who rolled their eyes when someone raised concerns. People who didn't agree with what he did but didn't intervene either. And somewhere in there, Camila had been one of them. Before it was her turn, she remembered an intake coordinator named Drew, barely 25, soft-spoken and visibly anxious. Richard had once publicly mocked the formatting of one of his reports. During a team meeting, Camila had said nothing. She told herself it wasn't her place. That she didn't want to jeopardize her own standing. That it was just Richard being Richard. She'd stayed silent. Like so many others, that night, she wrote an email, not to the board. To Drew. I wanted to apologize. Back when we worked together, I witnessed something I should have called out, and I didn't. I see now that silence is a kind of permission. I'm trying to do better. I hope you're well. She hit send. No guarantee he'd reply. But she needed to say it.by now. Camila understood, justice wasn't just about exposing one man. It was about unraveling the web that let him thrive, and confronting the parts of yourself woven into it. She poured another cup of tea, sat down, and began drafting Monique's statement. She wasn't just collecting evidence anymore, she was helping others find the language for what they'd always known but had never been allowed to say out loud. The morning Monique came over, Camila brewed coffee strong enough to anchor them both. Not just for the caffeine, for the ritual. The weight of the mugs, the hiss of the kettle, the grounding normalcy of two women sitting at a kitchen table. Monique arrived 10 minutes early. She looked older than Camila remembered, more lined around the eyes, hair pulled tightly into a bun that said professionalism before vulnerability. But her eyes, as they scanned the apartment, were open. Not guarded. Just tired. I thought I'd be more nervous, she said, slipping out of her coat. But I'm not. Camila poured 2 cups. You've already done the hard part. You remembered. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping. Then Monique reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly folded page. I wrote everything down. Even the things I wasn't sure were relevant. Camila unfolded it. June 2017. Anna's meeting with Bellman lasted exactly 17 minutes. I heard no shouting. But when she left, she didn't go back to her desk. She walked to the stairwell and sat on the bottom step, just staring. I brought her water. She said. He made it sound like I imagined everything. Then she said, I can't work for someone who thinks reality is optional. Camila's throat tightened. The wording, reality is optional, struck her as painfully precise. Do you remember what happened afterward? She asked. Monique nodded. She submitted her resignation that night. HR listed it as burnout. No follow-up. No exit interview. And by the next week, her email was deleted. All her documents archived under Bellman's name. Camila had seen the same sanitization process happen again and again. Personnel records edited. Departure reasons softened. All neat and tidy. That was Bellman's signature move. He never left fingerprints, only the feeling that something had been erased. Monique hesitated. Then she added, there's something else. Camila looked up. You know Emily, right? The intern from 2018? Camila remembered her vividly. Bright. Fast thinker. Always asking smart, anxious questions. Gone by Thanksgiving, she told me something once. Said Bellman had invited her to shadow a meeting, then told her afterward that she came across as unstable when she asked too many questions. His exact words were, you'll scare people if you don't learn how to modulate your curiosity. She left the program 2 weeks later. Camila's face remained still, but inside, something cracked. Did anyone report it? Monique shook her head. She was 23. He was a division chief. No one would have believed her. Camila exhaled slowly and scribbled the quote onto a legal pad. The phrasing was too familiar. It matched the one Richard had lobbed at her: unstable. The morning of the hearing. It was never random. It was always method. They worked for hours, reviewing the testimony draft, trimming the excess, anchoring it in memory. By early afternoon, they had a clean version, short, clear, emotionally grounded. Monique agreed to sign it. Camila walked her to the door. Before leaving, Monique paused and said softly, "I used to hear what they whispered behind the doors. After meetings. After reviews. About you." Camila didn't flinch. "What did they say?" "That you were sharp. But difficult. Too intense. Not a team player." Camila nodded. "Because I asked questions?" Monique's eyes were sad. "Because you didn't pretend not to know the answers." Camila opened the door. The hallway was quiet. "You know what I regret most?" Monique said. "What?" "Not the silence. That came later. I regret the doubt. The way I started questioning what I saw, even though I saw it clearly. That's what he did best. Made you think you were the problem." Camila squeezed her arm. "That's not your shame to carry anymore." When the door closed, Camila returned to her desk and scanned Monique's testimony, attaching it to the growing case file. 38 documents now. 11 testimonies. A timeline that ran like a slow fuse from 2013 to 2019. But something gnawed at her. She still hadn't heard from Drew, the young coordinator she'd emailed weeks ago. She opened her inbox. Nothing. A part of her wanted to let it go. People had a right to silence. But another part, the part that remembered the way Drew used to flinch when Bellman entered a room, couldn't forget. She opened a search window and typed his name. He was still working in the field, now in Oregon, at a trauma recovery center. She found a staff profile with a direct line. She didn't overthink it. She called. The voice on the other end was cautious but kind. "This is Drew." "Drew, it's Camila Serrano. From CPS in LA. A pause. Then, "I remember." She explained. Gently that she'd reached out, wasn't sure if he'd gotten the message. "I did," he said. "I just didn't know what to say." Camila didn't push. "That's okay. I just wanted you to know I regretted staying quiet that day in the meeting. You deserved someone to stand up for you." Silence. Then a breath. "You were the only one who looked at me that day," Drew said quietly. "That meant more than you think." They spoke for 20 minutes. About the agency. About the way it breaks you without drawing blood. Drew didn't have documentation, but he offered a summary of his experience, how after Bellman publicly humiliated him, he stopped sleeping, dropped 20 pounds, and considered quitting the field altogether. "But I didn't," Drew said. "I transferred. I kept going. I just carry it differently now." Camila asked if she could paraphrase his account. He agreed, on the condition that his name be left out for now. After the call, she added it to the file. No quote, just this line: "He carried the silence like a weight. But he carried it forward." That night, Camila sat on her balcony, the city buzzing beneath her. She watched the lights flicker on in windows across the street, families eating. Someone laughing too loud, a toddler running in circles in pajamas. Life continuing. She didn't feel at peace yet, but she felt something like momentum. Richard Bellman was suspended. The review was expanding. Whispers were becoming voices, and Camila was no longer the only one speaking. It started as a ripple. A policy email sent from the Office of Internal Affairs to regional department heads across California. All supervisory staff currently under formal review are to be temporarily restricted from case-based decision-making until the conclusion of said reviews. Camila read it 3 times, each word underlining a quiet truth. Richard Bellman wasn't just suspended, he was officially sidelined. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he no longer had authority over a single case file, staffing chart, or personnel meeting. And yet, within the agency's internal chatter, something darker began to pulse beneath the surface. Containment. Camila started hearing things. A colleague forwarded her a message thread, a conversation between mid-level supervisors in the West LA office. It was civil on the surface, but lined with code. "Let's not create panic over one disgruntled employee. Important to remember that context matters. Not all leadership styles are universally appreciated. Need to ensure morale doesn't dip. Maybe let this blow over quietly." They weren't talking to her. But they were talking about her, not with rage. With caution. With that same tone the agency always used when trying to protect itself from accountability. Soft, procedural, dry, minimize. Reframe. Move on. The institutional version of, "She's unstable." Camila knew this language. She'd translated it for years, helping survivors of family abuse understand how manipulation dressed itself in calm logic. But seeing it applied here, toward herself, toward the inquiry, was something else entirely. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about the people who'd stayed quiet because of him, and the ones who needed him to be the villain. So they didn't have to look at their own reflection. That afternoon, she received a message from an old friend inside the agency, Teresa, an HR admin who had always kept her head down but her eyes open. "They're not coming after you. Not directly. But I'm hearing phrases like, questionable motivation, timing seems tactical, and even one person say, it's not healthy for someone to hold on to resentment this long." Camila stared at the screen. Not healthy. As if truth had an expiration date, she picked up her notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of a blank page: survival is strategy. She thought back to all the employees who had left quietly, choosing mental health over confrontation. Who had restructured their lives around never having to explain why they couldn't sleep, why they flinched at benign authority, why their confidence had slowly eroded. They hadn't filed complaints because they didn't want to be called angry, or emotional, or unprofessional. They hadn't wanted to be her, but now she was already her. Publicly. And she wasn't backing down. 2 days later, the review board requested a supplemental meeting. The official notice said they wanted to clarify the breadth of cultural patterns within the department. Camila understood immediately. They weren't just reviewing Richard anymore, they were looking at the ecosystem. She prepared carefully, not with more accusations, but with what she knew would cut deeper: the sanctioned indifference. The session, seated across from the panel again, Camila began differently. "This isn't about one abusive man," she said calmly. "It's about how our systems protect the charisma of dysfunction when it's packaged in professionalism." She handed them a document titled, Observed Bystander Responses to Alleged Psychological Misconduct, 2014 to 2019. It wasn't fancy. Just 5 pages. But on each one, she outlined documented instances when coworkers witnessed Richard's behavior and responded with silence, dismissal, or redirection. Emails where concerns were rephrased as personality clashes. Review notes softened to avoid conflict. Staff meetings where someone was humiliated and no one intervened. She quoted directly from exit interviews. "I didn't feel empowered to speak up. There was a sense that loyalty meant silence. Leadership seemed more interested in optics than accountability. We were told to manage up instead of name what was happening." Camila closed the file and looked at the panel. This is what institutional gaslighting looks like. Not violence. Not yelling. Just the slow corrosion of credibility. A place where asking for help gets reframed as being difficult. Where calling out mistreatment is seen as destabilizing. The chairwoman folded her hands. "We understand your concern, Ms. Serrano. And you've made a compelling case. But may I ask, why continue? You're retired. You've left. Why keep going?" Camila held her gaze. "Because I left with a version of myself I didn't recognize. Quiet. Disoriented. Half of who I used to be. And I've since heard from dozens of people who left the same way. This isn't about holding a grudge. It's about refusing to let this machine recycle harm and call it professionalism." She took a breath. Then added, quieter, "I don't want an apology. I want a record." The panel was silent for a long moment. Finally, one member spoke. "We're moving forward with a broader cultural audit. You may be contacted for further input." Camila nodded. "I'll be ready." That night, Camila received a message from Richard Bellman. Subject, no subject. "You made your point. I hope it was worth it. You've turned something professional into something personal. And I hope, for your sake, you're ready for the consequences that come with that." She stared at the screen. For a long time, then she replied. "It was always personal, Richard. You just convinced yourself it wasn't because you never had to live with the aftermath. But we did. And now we're speaking." She hit send, closed the laptop, and for the first time in years, slept 8 hours without waking. Camila sat at the cafe 2 blocks from the old courthouse, watching people pass by through the wide front window. Morning traffic rolled past lazily, a stroller bumping along the sidewalk, a woman in scrubs sipping an iced coffee. Life happening around her. It no longer felt distant. She'd stopped expecting a dramatic conclusion. There would be no singular courtroom moment, no gavel-pounding justice into being. The reckoning she'd triggered wasn't theatrical. It was bureaucratic. Slow. Measured. Deep, and it was working. The internal audit had expanded into a department-wide assessment. A consulting group, neutral, firm, expensive, had been brought in to interview staff, review procedural history, and assess leadership culture. Camila wasn't the only one they wanted to talk to. In the past 2 weeks, 3 former employees messaged her, stunned that investigators had reached out about their time under Bellman. One wrote, "It felt like someone was finally connecting the dots I thought only existed in my own head." Another, "I walked out of that job feeling broken and paranoid. Now, someone's validating that it wasn't just me." Camila responded to every message. Encouraged. Listened. Quietly collected more fragments of a truth long ignored, but for every person who stepped forward, there were others still clinging to neutrality, and a few already trying to reshape the narrative. That afternoon, she received a phone call from Dina Lambert, a former mid-level administrator and longtime ally of Richard's. "I heard you've been active," Dina said, not unkindly. "I've been honest," Camila replied. Dina exhaled softly. "Look, I'm not saying there wasn't tension. Bellman was intense. But this witch hunt? It's bad for morale. It's making people scared. To manage assertively." Camila's pulse didn't change. If people are confusing coercion with leadership, they should be scared. Dina didn't respond right away. "Then, do you really think taking him down changes anything?" Camila answered with no hesitation. "I think naming it changes everything. Because that's what had always protected Richard, the unwillingness of others to name what they saw. His behavior was always framed in abstractions, firm expectations, demanding excellence, not everyone's style." Camila's story, and those that followed, had shattered the euphemisms. Later that week, Camila received an invitation from the Department of Social Services to speak at a closed roundtable discussion. Not public. Not filmed. Just 20 administrators from different regions reviewing case studies in leadership breakdown. She knew exactly what that meant. She almost declined, but the night before, she opened a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside, copies of old field notes, client drawings from children she'd worked with, a faded thank you card from a mother whose kids had been returned after 2 years of recovery. "You never made me feel like a failure. You made me believe I could try again." Camila stared at the handwriting for a long time. Then she RSVP'd. "Yes. I'll attend." The roundtable was held in a sterile conference room downtown. Bottled water on every table. Name placards. Soft lighting that made everyone look slightly faded. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't bring a slideshow. No stats. Just a single sheet of paper. "I want to talk about complicity," she began. "Not the loud kind, the silent kind. The kind that lives in hallway glances and rewritten memos. The kind that looks like compliance but feels like betrayal." She spoke plainly. No righteous fire. Just truth. When someone in power harms others without obvious bruises, the institution has a choice: protect the image or protect the people. My agency chose the image. For years. She glanced around the table. "I don't believe every leader is abusive. But I do believe most institutions are afraid of what it means to admit that they let abuse hide in plain sight." Someone on the other side, a director from Sacramento, raised a hand. "What would you have wanted, realistically? Back then?" Camila thought for a moment. "I would have wanted someone, anyone, to walk into a room and say, 'I believe you. And we're going to look deeper, even if it's uncomfortable.' That's all. Not a firing. Not a lawsuit. Just the willingness to look." She folded her page. Because once someone feels invisible, it takes years to come back. There was a long silence. Then, slowly, nods. After the session, 2 people approached her privately. One handed her a business card. Another simply said, "Thank you. I think I've been part of the silence." Camila didn't offer comfort. Just honesty. "Then use your voice now. It still matters." That night, her phone buzzed with a message from Layla. "Mom. Just read the audit memo. He's officially under disciplinary review, and they're calling it institutional failure to intervene. That phrase wouldn't exist if not for you. I'm proud of you. Every version of me, the child you protected, the adult I've become. All of us are proud." Camila smiled, eyes wet, because for years, she had walked through that agency believing she was the problem. Then she realized the problem was the way silence had been weaponized, to protect power, to corrode truth, to normalize pain. Now the silence was cracking, and inside that rupture, new voices were rising. The official announcement came on a quiet Wednesday morning, delivered in neutral bureaucratic phrasing that tried, and failed, to soften the blow. Effective immediately, Richard Bellman has resigned from his position with the Department of Child and Family Services. A comprehensive audit of leadership practices within the region is underway. We remain committed to fostering a culture of psychological safety, transparency, and accountability. No admission of wrongdoing. No mention of the investigation. No context, just a quiet, calculated erasure. Camila read the memo in full, then closed her laptop. She didn't cheer. She didn't even exhale. She simply stood up, walked to her kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. He was gone, removed from the institution he'd sculpted in his image for nearly 2 decades, the image of quiet coercion wrapped in professional charm. But what lingered wasn't relief. It was the echo of everything his absence revealed. A dozen texts came in that morning. Tyrese, not justice, but closure. Or at least a version of it. Janelle, I cried when I saw the memo. I didn't even know I still had that in me. Drew, unexpectedly, I didn't think this day would come. Thank you for keeping the door open for the rest of us. Even Teresa, the admin who had slipped her warnings discreetly along the way, wrote, now the real work begins. Camila replied to each one with care, and then she let herself feel something closer to release. Not satisfaction, that word. Felt too sharp, too simple. What she felt was weightlessness, like a bag she'd been carrying for years had finally been set down and left behind. That afternoon, she went to the lake near her apartment. Sat on the bench she used to visit after long shifts when she still worked at the agency. It was quiet, ducks grazing near the reeds, a breeze ruffling the tall grass. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was bracing for anything. The next week, Camila received a formal request to assist in the ongoing leadership reform initiative. They wanted her not just as a witness, but as a participant, to help shape the training curriculum for management staff across the state. Her first instinct was to say no. She was retired. She'd fought her fight. She had paid the price, but then she remembered something Layla had said during a phone call weeks ago. You don't owe anyone a crusade, Mom. But if you've already walked through the fire, maybe it means you know how to build something fireproof. So she said yes, not because she wanted to stay in the system, but because she wanted to help rebuild what had been quietly broken for so long. The first training module Camila wrote was titled The Performance of Niceness, Recognizing Emotional Harm Behind Professional Masks. It began with a sentence she had once scribbled in a journal during the early days of her unraveling, not all abuse is loud. She paired real-world scenarios with survivor reflections. Designed exercises around implicit bias in leadership. Feedback. Included anonymized quotes from exit interviews that had once been ignored. She wanted supervisors to see what trauma looked like before it turned into attrition. In a follow-up call with the state's training coordinator, Camila emphasized, I don't need people to become experts in psychology. I just need them to stop mistaking someone's silence for agreement, and someone's distress for instability. Meanwhile, the stories kept coming. More former employees reached out. Some from other regions. Some from other departments. Some who had never met Richard but recognized the same patterns under different names, different titles, different cities. The system was wide. The names changed. The harm rarely did, but now, something was visible. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the quiet structures that enabled him. The HR officers who learned to smooth things over. The supervisors who avoided hard conversations. The well-meaning colleagues who whispered support behind closed doors but never took public stands. Camila received a message from someone anonymous. Just an email address and one sentence. I used to think keeping my head down made me strong. You reminded me it just made me complicit. She didn't know who it was. She didn't need to point. One morning, Camila received an invitation to speak at a university panel on leadership and institutional ethics. She almost laughed at the irony. A year ago, no one would have associated her name with that kind of topic. Now, students were quoting lines from the statement she gave to the board. She agreed to appear, but only if they let her share the platform with two others, Tyrese and Janelle. If we're talking about rebuilding, she told the organizers, they need to hear how damage actually feels. Not just from me. They agreed. In the weeks that followed, Camila found herself doing things she hadn't planned, or wanted, to do again, speaking in rooms full of people. Telling the same story. Naming the same truths, but this time, she wasn't just reliving it, she was translating it. Into policy. Into training. Into language that might help someone catch the pattern before it calcified. And slowly, the public narrative began to shift. The agency didn't call it misconduct anymore. They started using words like emotional abuse, psychological safety, and ethical leadership failure. Words that hadn't existed in their official language when Camila left. She helped put them there. Still, there were quiet days. Nights when she wondered what her life would have looked like if she'd spoken up sooner. If she'd refused to let herself be isolated. If someone, anyone, had said, I believe you, in time to stop the worst of the damage. But regrets only grow if you water them. Camila chose to plant something else. One evening, as the sun slid behind the city skyline, Layla called. You seem lighter, she said. I think I am, Camila replied. Do you feel done? Camila smiled softly. No. But I feel changed. Because that's what survival looks like. When it finally finds its voice, not revenge, not vindication, but transformation, and transformation echoes longer than silence ever could. The auditorium was small, not grand, maybe 50 seats, but every chair was filled. Students, educators, junior administrators. A quiet, eager audience that didn't yet know the cost of what Camila was about to describe. She stood beside a modest podium, no projection screen behind her, just a single wooden table with a glass of water and a folded paper. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to remember out loud, and to offer something even rarer in institutional spaces, a truth without disguise. Tyrese sat in the front row. Janelle beside him. Both of them had spoken earlier in the panel, steady, unscripted, devastating. They told their stories plainly, with no melodrama, describing the psychological erosion of working beneath someone who never raised his voice but never stopped cutting. When it was Camila's turn, she didn't read from the page. She simply began, "I was once told I was too intense. That I took things personally. That I needed to let go of things that couldn't be proven." She looked out at the room. Young faces. Open faces. Some curious. Some skeptical. Some already familiar with what she meant, and trying not to flinch. "I believed those words for a long time," she said. "Because when enough people around you suggest that your pain is disproportionate, you start to wonder if the pain is the problem, not the cause of it." She paused. "That's how quiet abuse survives, by making the target question the shape of their own suffering." She told them the rest, not every detail, but the arc, the years of subtle control. The whispers. The gaslighting. The culture that backed away when someone pointed too closely at the rot beneath the surface. The names she remembered. The ones she couldn't forget, and how it didn't end with one confrontation, or even one report. "It ended," she said softly, "when I stopped needing the people who protected him to validate what I knew." There was silence, then a single hand raised. A student. Maybe 20. Nervous. "How did you keep going when no one backed you up? I mean, wasn't it exhausting to always be the one bringing the truth into the room?" Camila smiled, not sadly, but knowingly. "It was. Until I realized I wasn't alone. I just hadn't made it safe enough for others to speak yet." She gestured toward Tyrese. Toward Janelle. They were always there. So were others. But systems built on fear don't allow people to align easily. You don't just need courage to speak. You need someone else to hear you without flinching. Another hand. Another question. "How do we stop this from happening again?" Camila didn't answer right away. Then she said, simply, "Start by believing discomfort is not the same as disloyalty. The person who asks hard questions isn't your enemy. The person who dissents calmly isn't unstable. And when someone names the harm you didn't want to see, thank them. Don't manage them out." After the panel, as the room emptied, a young administrator approached her. He was tall, neatly dressed, face tight with something he was clearly trying to hold in. "My mother was in a job like that," he said quietly. "It broke her down. She was never the same. I think she would have wanted someone like you to exist back then." Camila touched his arm gently. "Then let her voice live through what you do next." He nodded, eyes shining. Weeks passed. The training program Camila helped design was approved. Agencies across the state began rolling it out, not as a checklist, but as a conversation model. Supervisors were being asked for the first time not just what decisions they made, but how those decisions made people feel. There were pushbacks. Resistance. But also something else, momentum. The phrase, emotional climate, began showing up in internal assessments. Psychological safety became a line item in promotion reviews. HR officers were being retrained. Exit interviews were redesigned. The changes were imperfect, but they were real. On the one-year anniversary of Richard Bellman's resignation, Camila did something small and quiet. She visited the CPS building one last time. Not to protest. Not to gloat, just to say goodbye. The building looked the same, faded bricks, institutional gray, but she didn't walk inside. She stood at the sidewalk, touched the edge of the fence, and exhaled. Behind her, the city moved on. New workers stepped into roles she once held. New challenges waited. But the culture she had left behind, the one that whispered and excused and concealed, had been cracked open. Some might forget her name, but they would remember what happened, because institutional memory doesn't live in plaques or reports. It lives in the people who refuse to let silence win. That evening, she walked home, unhurried. At her door, she found an envelope, no return address. Inside was a card. "You were right. I wasn't ready to speak then. But I'm ready now. Thank you for being the voice I needed to hear first." Camila folded the note, smiled, and placed it gently in a drawer alongside the others, not to hoard them, but to remember that every story told truthfully becomes a door for someone else. And the room after the fire, it doesn't have to be silent. It can be rebuilt, one voice at a time.